Good here, they good? There we go. Good to be with you, my friends. Let's pull up the old PowerPoint and jump right in. There we go. All right, so last week we looked at the start of chapter 4, really the story of Cain and Abel. We talked about murder, we talked about society, we talked about sin, all those kinds of fun things. And we also looked at Steinbeck's reflection on Tim Shell, the Thou Mayest idea, along with a little bit as well of Rene Girard. So now we're going to jump into lots of in-between stuff. So literally this is how it continues. Verse 17, Cain knew his wife, and she became pregnant and bore Hanok. Now he became the builder of a city and called the city's name according to his son's name, Hanok. To Hanok was born Irad. Irad begot Meuel. Meuel begot Metushael. How do you pronounce that? Metushael begot Lamech. Lamech took himself 2 wives. The name of the first one was Ada. The name of the second was Zillah. Ada bore Yaval. He was the father of those who sit amidst tent and herd. His brother's name was Yuval. He was the father of all those who play the lyre, pipe. And Zillah bore as well Tuval Cain, burnisher of every blade of bronze and iron. Tuval Cain's sister was Naamah. Lamech said to his wives Ada and Tizel, hearken to my voice, wives of Lamech, give ear to my saying. I, man, a kill for wounded me, a lad for only bruising me. Aye, if 7-fold vengeance be for Cain, and for Lamech 77-fold. Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son, and she called his name Shet. Granted one, meaning God has granted me another seed in place of Hevel, for Cain killed him. To Shet was born a son, to Shet as well a son was born. He called his name Enosh, mortal. And at that time, they first called out the name of the Lord. All right, so Adam knew his wife. I bet everybody knows this word in Hebrew, but they don't actually realize they know it. Does anybody know the Hebrew word for know, to know? Nope, it's from Seinfeld, if that helps. Yada, 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 yada. Just means to know. So there's a joke in Seinfeld where they say yada, yada, yada. Just means I know, I know, I know. But yeah, so that's all it is. And this needs to be said, like all aspects of life, and that all of them appear in the Bible. Sex is mentioned often, but it's almost always euphemistically. This is one of the most common. Adam knew his wife. Is always one code name for had sex with his wife, knew his wife. The other is Yada, right? So that's one of them. Adam knew his wife. The other will come here in just a minute, where they say like the angels came into the human women, which comes as in Genesis 6:4, which is the idea in both Hebrew and Aramaic, and this is a quote from the Shocking Bible, the man entering the woman's tent for the purposes of sex, right? So in both cases, we have a pretty good idea of what it means, but it is always euphemistic. There's not actually I've never seen it. If there is a word for sex in Hebrew, it's not there. It's always a euphemism like this of some sort. And then, well, we've got genealogies. Whew. All right. Brueggemann says about genealogies in Genesis are used to tie together stories which originally had no connection. You've got a story and a story and a story, and there's sort of these genealogies that bridge the gaps, but they're just sort of awkward. We're not really sure what to do with them. First, today we have Cain's genealogy, which is interesting, mainly because he's not cut off from family, right? The last time we heard about him, he was being kicked out and had a mark put on him that God was both protecting him and condemning him, but somehow he's still allowed to have family. In fact, he's allowed to start cities, right? So it's just interesting that we have this genealogy, that he's allowed to have life and progeny and the whole 9 yards, right? His son starts the first known city and civilization begins. It's really actually Cain, who does that first city, but it's named after the first son. but that's where civilization begins, like we talked about last time. Then what comes with a city? The arts. This is the earliest mention of art with his sons Jubal and Jabal, or Jubal and Jabal. There's no J in Hebrew, it's always a Y. Are metalworkers and musicians, right? So it's just interesting that that's one of the first things that they say they build a city, and then the very next thing they mention are the arts, and how important that is biblically. Then it becomes sort of central and fascinating. The list ends with Shet or Seth, the explicit replacement of Abel, and the future follows this son of Adam. And Seth means one for life or gifted for life, right? So it's just interesting that we sort of get this side note about what happens with Cain. He sort of continues, he has his life, but then the family very much continues in a different direction. So when you talk about the genealogy in the beginning of Matthew that goes all the way back to Adam, it goes through Seth, right? And that's it. There's not really much else to talk about for that opening part. Unless there's any deep thoughts on the genealogy of Cain. All right, well, because we just continue with more genealogy. So this is now the record of the beginnings of Adam, of humankind. At the time of God's creating humankind in the likeness of God did he make them. Did he then make it? Male and female, he created them and gave blessings to them and called their name humankind on the day of their being created. When Adam had lived 30 and 100 years, he begot one in his likeness, according to his image, and called his name Shet. Adam's days after he begot Shet were 800 years, and he begot other sons and daughters. And all the days that Adam lived were 900 years and 30 years. Then he died. When Shet had lived for 500 years, he begot Enosh. And Shet lived after he begot Enosh 700 and 800 years. 7 years and 800 years. Sorry, I get this backwards. And begot other sons and daughters. And all the days of Shet were 12 years and 900 years. Then he died. When Enosh had lived 90 years, he begot Kenan. Enosh is an early bloomer. he did it under 100. And Enosh lived after begot Kenan 15 years and 800 years, and begot other sons and daughters. And all the days of Enosh were 5 years and 900 years, and then he died. And when Kenan had lived 70 years, he begot Mehalel. And Kenan lived after he begot Mehalel 40 years and 800 years, and begot other sons and daughters. And all the days of Kenan were 10 years and 900 years, and then he died. And when Mehalel had lived 5 years and 60 years, he begot Yered. And Mehalel lived after he begot Yered 30 years and 800 years, and begot other sons and daughters. And all the days of Mehalel were 95 years and 800 years, and then he died. And when Yered had lived 62 years and 100 years, he begot Henoch. And Yered lived after he begot Henoch 800 years, and begot other sons and daughters. And all the days of Mehalel were 95 years and 800 years, and then he died. And when Yered had lived 62 years and 100 years, he begot Henoch. And Yered lived after he begot Henoch 800 years, and begot other sons and daughters. And all the days of Yered were 62 years and 900 years, and then he died. And when Henoch had lived 65 years, he begot Methuselah. And Henoch walked in accord with God after he begot Methuselah 300 years, and begot other sons and daughters. All the days of Henoch were 65 years and 300 years. Now Henoch walked in accord with God, and he was no more, for God had taken him. When Methuselah had lived 87 years and 100 years, he begot Lamech. And Methuselah lived after he begot Lamech 82 years and 700 years, and begot other sons and daughters. And all the days of Methuselah were 69 years and 900 years, and then he died. When Lamech had lived 82 years and 100 years, he begot a son, and he called his name Noah, saying, "May this one comfort our sorrow from our toil, from the pains of our hands coming from the soil which the Lord has damned." And Lamech lived after he begot Noah 95 years and 500 years and begot other sons and daughters. And all the days of Lamech were 77 years and 700 years, and then he died. And when Noah was 500 years old, Noah begot Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now was when humans first became many on the face of the soil, and women were born to them, that the divine beings saw how beautiful the women were. So they took themselves wives, whomever they chose. The Lord said, my rushing spirit shall not remain in humankind for all ages, for they too are flesh. Let their days be then 120 years. The giants, the Nephilim, were on earth in those days and afterwards as well, when the divine beings came into the human women and they bore them children. They were the heroes who were of former ages, the men of name. All right, a whole big, wonderful genealogy. Whew. So Brueggemann and other scholars speak for a while about the 10 generations from Adam to the flood, and there's 10, talking about how it's fullness and how it might mean this and it might mean that. Ultimately, we don't know. It's just to say that there was a long season from the time that Adam was there until humanity spread across the earth, and then there was the flood, right?
Well, they must have been counting time a lot differently to be saying these people lived to be 800 and 900 years old.
Yeah, there's lots of theories about that, and it's not altogether clear. If they were counting time differently, if they were counting it as like, I don't know, what we would third or fifth of the years or something like that, I don't know, but who knows?
If you take
there's a list, another genealogy that comes after Noah that goes from from Noah to Abraham, which sort of gets back to Brueggemann's idea that these are really sort of lists that just connect the big stories, right? Here's the stuff that happened in between. Some stuff happened, but it's not worth getting into. So what we can say is almost all human stories have legends of giants and have an early prehistory where the divine and man were closer, right? Whether you're talking about the Egyptian pantheon and stories like about Hercules and these sort of demigods, or the same thing is true for the gods of Egypt, the gods of Babylon, the gods of Rome, all had these sort of ideas of this prehistory where humanity was great and mighty and wonderful, or back in the days of Middle Earth, like Tolkien, right? All these wonderful things that used to happen. But that said, in the Bible, we do have part of that. We have the giants. The Nephilim are part of that legend, but we ultimately know very, very little about it. This is taken directly from the Encyclopedia Britannica. The Nephilim are in the Hebrew Bible, a group of mysterious beings or people of unusually large size and strength who lived before and after the flood. The Nephilim are referenced in Genesis and Numbers and are possibly referred to in Ezekiel. The Hebrew word Nephilim is sometimes directly translated as giants or taken to mean the fallen ones from the Hebrew Nephal, which means to fall. All right, so here's the thing. It shows up here. It largely disappears from the text after the flood, right? The flood happens. The Nephilim seem to be wiped out like everybody else. But giants don't. We have another group called the Rephaim, which are giants who live in the Promised Land, who live in Canaan. The Israelites are afraid. If you remember when Moses is taking them back to the Promised Land, they're afraid to go to the Promised Land because they see giants there. And Moses has to defeat King Og, the Amorite, who has a bed that is 14 feet long, which would make him 11 or 12 feet tall. And yes, that would be a giant by any estimation, right? And we don't really know what to do with it because it's just one random little story about how they fight the giants and Israelites win, and that's the end of the Rephaim, right? That's all we have. We can't do a lot more with it, but you will hear about them from time to time. People will reference them in different ways. Random note, this is your Hebrew note of the day. I am is like an S in English. This denotes the plural, right? So the Nephilim are giants. Nephil is a singular giant. The seraphim are angels. The seraph is singular, right? So you don't say they're seraphs, you say they're seraphim. You don't say they're cherubs, you say they're cherubim, right? If you're following the at least the Hebrew side of it. People say cherubs all the time and they'll say seraphs all the time. because they don't know the Hebrew side, which is fine. It's just a name. It's different. The interesting one, the word for God or gods is Elohim, which can be translated in two different ways, and it's where context clues matter. You can say Elohim and refer to the gods of the Palestinian, not Palestinians, the gods of the Philistines, right? And it's Elohim. But you can also say Elohim, and because it means all the gods in one, it can refer to the God of Israel. And then that can be sometimes abbreviated as El. So when you talk about the Old Testament, that's why things are confusing sometimes in the Old Testament. Sometimes you've got El, and sometimes you've got Elohim, and sometimes you have the name of God, the four-letter word, right? That is the name of the Lord. So you have all three of those things are used together for God, which is why it can be confusing, and why they've also sort of broken those out for different sources, because different names are used for God in different times. Anyway, there's your Hebrew note for the Nephilim. What we can say, regardless, though, is that God ends the era of long lifespans. Whatever those mean, God suddenly says, nope, that's enough. 120 years or so should be good. And we don't get really a reason other than God just wants it to be that way, right? There's not a theological reason or a scientific reason. It's just sort of God said, enough of these 1,000-year-old guys like Methuselah. We're done. We're done. I want some short ones. Any other thoughts? This is, again, we're sort of racing through this section because there's not a whole lot to hang our hat on, but happy to talk about it more if you're interested in the Nephilim or the Rephaim or the genealogy of Adam and Seth to Noah.
Bill, the letters, what is it? LVMH, is that what it is? Which means God, but what do the letters mean?
Oh, are you talking about for the four-letter name of God?
Yes.
So it's YHWH, right? And we will sometimes you will hear people pronounce it as Yahweh, but it's the whole problem with Hebrew is there's no vowels in ancient Hebrew. Like if you look at a scroll, if you go to the synagogue and see a scroll of the text, there are no vowels. It's all by tradition, and so it's sort of confusing. And so YHWH it's called the Tetragrammaton, the four-letter name of God. It's what basically Moses asks, "Who are you?" and he says Yahweh, like that YHWH, which is a related thing to I am. And the main reason we even use those letters is because those particular vowels is because that's what you do when you say the name of God. You say Jehovah instead, or the Lord, and so they add those vowels in. It's sort of confusing. So that's just the other name of God.
Okay. Thanks.
Sure.
I'm sort of intrigued with this thing of the giants, all these. I
Yeah.
guess I thought like David and Goliath, I thought Goliath was just some random guy. And this this makes you think there were a lot of giants.
Yep. You think there were, but we haven't found any skeletons of 12-foot tall men. So
No.
I think that would be something we would hear a lot about if somebody came across the skeleton, the giant skeleton graveyard, right?
Right.
But
That's great.
but there's lots of conversation about them. I mean, it shows up over and over again, but it's hard to say. And this is where, more than a few scholars have said things about like, well, were they giants in terms of being physically large, or were they just sort of legendary characters, right? Because we will talk about somebody being a giant of science. And we don't mean Marie Curie is a physically tall person. We just mean that she's one of the few people to win 2 Nobel Prizes and discover like half of the radiation concepts that we still rely on, right? She was a giant of her industry, but not physically a large person.
Well, and I always thought, when you look back, people were so much smaller at one time than they are now, that I thought someone who was 6 foot tall might have been considered a giant,
Right.
If you're 4 foot something, a 6 foot tall person would look like a giant to you.
Yeah, well, that's sort of the So if you ever go to Rome and see the Colosseum, I always tell people to look at the seats because they're tiny. They're very, very small because nutrition was different and they were smaller people. And the average height of the Roman Empire was something like 5'6" or 5'5" for men, and women were around 5 feet or a little lower, right? They were smaller people.
Yeah.
And which then makes it even more interesting. One of Rome's requirements to become a centurion, to be a soldier of Rome, was they wanted people who were 6 feet tall, which would have been giants, right? They wanted physically large people, men, to wear the armor, which we would not say are giants now. But if most people, the average soul is 5'5", then yeah, 6 foot tall, 6'1" is a giant, right? That's a big person.
You know, in the stories of St. Columba, they said he was 7 feet tall. And that was when he went into battle against King Fergus. He slew 800 men in one day because he was so much bigger.
Could be, yeah.
And another thing too, when I was in Europe in 1969, I was in Rodenburg, Diorba, and we were in a bar that was built in the 1300s where we watched them walk on the moon. The ceiling in that bar was only 5'5".
Yeah. Yeah.
And even I had to duck a little bit, and I'm 5'8". So it tells you a little bit about the difference in the size of people.
Yes, absolutely. All right, well, so we'll turn the corner to all kinds of new stuff, the flood itself, right? So now the Lord saw that great was humankind.
Nobody wants to talk about angels and humans conjugating. Huh?
Well, okay, let's talk about it. That was pretty special.
Is that a heavenly moment?
That's absolutely the most stunning part of all of Genesis. Maybe the entire
That the angels and the humans got together.
Nobody talked about it. I am just shocked.
We depend on you.
It's a heavenly moment.
It must have been a heavenly moment.
We just go over that, right? Oh, we did not read that, right? Okay, good. All right.
Yeah. Well, it's like most of the list as well. You go, well, all right, I guess that happened. I don't know what to do with that, right?
Theology behind that, huh? Okay, good. All right.
I don't know. Yeah. Why were those angels coming down and hanging out with the humans like that? It was because the women were so beautiful. That's why they came down.
Okay.
I'm glad they didn't keep those genealogies, because I'm sure you want to talk about somebody talking about how great they are. Well, I'm related to the angels on my mom's side or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh gosh. That could explain why people live so long, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
That too.
If they had angel blood in them.
Absolutely, yeah.
I know angels had blood.
I don't know.
Nice.
Sorry, Bill. I just couldn't let it go.
No, I like it. All right. So here you go, Roy. That's where they have that name of God, that YHWH. Now
Yes.
the Lord saw that great was humankind's evil doing on earth, and every form of their heart's planning was only evil all the day. Then the Lord was sorry that he had made humankind on earth, and it pained his heart. The Lord said, I will blot out humankind whom I have created from the face of the soil, from man to beast to crawling thing and to the fowl of the heavens, for I am sorry that I made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And these are the beginnings of Noah. Noah was a righteous, wholehearted man in his generation. In accord with God did Noah walk. And Noah begot 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth had gone to ruin before God. The earth was filled with wrongdoing. God saw the earth, and here it had gone to ruin, for all flesh had ruined its way upon the earth. And God said to Noah, an end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with wrongdoing through them. Here, I'm about to bring ruin upon them along with the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. With reeds make the ark and cover it within and without with pitch, with a covering of pitch. And this is how you are to make it. 300 cubits the length of the ark, 50 cubits its breadth, and 30 cubits its height. A skylight you are to make for the ark, finishing it to a cubit upward. The entrance of the ark you are to set in its side with a lower, a second, and a third deck you are to make it. As for me, here, I am about to bring on the deluge, water upon the earth, to bring ruin upon all flesh that has rush of life in it. From under the heavens, all that is on earth will perish. But I will establish my covenant with you. You are to come into the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. From all living things and from all flesh, you are to bring two from all into the ark to remain alive with you. They are to be a male and a female each. From fowl after their kind, from herd animals after their kind, from all crawling things of the soil after their kind, two from all are to come to you to remain alive. And as for you, take for yourself from all edible things that are eaten and gather it to you. It shall be for you and for them for eating. Noah did it according to all that God commanded him, and so he did. All right, so Noah gets his instructions to build the ark without the fun commentary of Bill Cosby or countless other midrash stories about how others saw this crazy action, right? We have all kinds of some wonderful tales that people have told, movies and otherwise, about, all the neighbors making fun of Noah and what was it like to build an ark and only get these sort of bare bones instructions and suddenly have to give up everything you have to build an ark on dry land, all that kind of stuff. They're great stories, but just it's not in the scripture, right? We have a very bare bones 300 feet long, or 300 cubits long, 500 cubits wide, 50 cubits wide. There you go build that. Not exactly detailed plans.
How much is a cubit?
Cubit is from your elbow to the tip of your index finger.
Hmm.
So about 2.5, 3 feet, give or take. Problem is, everybody, that measurement for every human being is different. So it's one of the many measurements in history that you go, well, how much is a cubit? Well, it depends on the guy. And if they're a giant or not, right? Back to our giant conversation. So personally, I'd have lots of questions. Noah just sort of accepts it. But the interesting thing that we have, that I will say that is far more interesting, is how Brueggemann has engaged this and sees it, which he sees a God who is both engaged in creation and upset, right? So we have to take a step back and say what we need to deal with is this is a God that's changeable, right? This is a God that seems to change his mind, both in which of the offerings he'll accept, why Abel versus Cain's, why does he decide to set certain rules versus other things, all those kinds of issues, right? So we have to go back and unpack what we're dealing with. The Greeks are the ones who did this to us. They had an ideal that a deity or an ideal deity should be four things, right? Omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, or all-powerful, all-present, all-knowing, and all-loving. That's the ideal God, right? And Christian thinkers, as they were living in the Greek world and starting to make that leap from the Hebrew, basically this Jewish Hebrew Messiah, but trying to translate it into Greek, which the whole New Testament is written in Greek, but also into Greek thinking, they started to take on these ideals of omnipotence and omnipresence and omniscience and omnibenevolence, right? And so if you talk about God, most people will say that God is these four things, usually with the helping of impassibility. Impassibility just means that God can't change, right? If God makes a promise, God will keep God's promise. Because if he's all-knowing, then he would make a promise without being able to keep it. If he's all-powerful, what would prevent him from keeping it in the first place, right? And if he's all-knowing, he would know the situations that could possibly exist to make you change your mind, right? all these kinds of things create this being that is completely other and completely outside our realm of understanding, which isn't bad. That's just how we've dealt with it, right? So if you ask most Christians about these 4 topics, they would all say, yes, that's the God of Jesus. That's the God of the Bible. Yeah. Here's the problem. While we talk about God in those terms, it is not, and I can't make that large enough, not the God of Genesis. God is deeply concerned and deeply connected to all of creation and seems to know a lot, but not all. He seems to care, but is not impassible. He seems more human and arbitrary than the Greeks want God to be, right? And that could be, let's stop there for just a second. That could be like what we saw in that first story in the garden, right? Like Adam and Eve eat of the fruit, the forbidden fruit, and he walks in the garden at the time of the evening breeze, a great image of God. But then God has to call out and go, hey, where are you guys? Right? Which is not an omnipotent being. Like he wouldn't have to say, hey, where'd you guys go? He'd go, I see you behind the bushes. Right? Or there'd be some other comment of, why are you hiding behind the bushes? But instead it's, where are you? And then it's like, oh, well, we were naked. Well, wait, who told you you were naked, right? I mean, there's all these lines that are much more a human conversation or on the human side of a conversation than they are in that omnipotent or omniscient or impassible being, right? And so God says, oh, well, I mean, he decreed that if you eat of the fruit of knowledge of good and evil, then I'll kill you. And then he changes his mind and decrees life instead. So even that alone says, uh-oh, God can change God's mind when God chooses, right? All of these things fly in the face of what the Greeks want God to be, but it's what we deal with in Genesis and why we have a very different view of God when you read the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, whatever you want to call it. And it's not a God who's hateful. That's not how it works. People love to say, oh, the God of the New Testament is all loving. And you're like, no, the God of the Old Testament said, I could have killed Adam and Eve, but I chose to give them life. That's a loving God. It's God of the Old Testament that actually talks about grace a lot. But it is this sort of fascinating entity, this being who is not human, still is absolutely beyond our idea of power, but we have a more human perception of God in the Old Testament and in Genesis specifically, right? Let's pause there because that's a big thing to put in front of people because most folks don't realize we've added Greek thought to Hebrew text, but that's what we did.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, in addition to that, Bill, if you take a look at the God of Genesis, it's not the God of Isaiah, sticking in the Old Testament. Okay. I mean, I actually view the Old Testament as the concept of God maturing, if that makes any sense at all.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know when all of the texts were written, right? But Genesis certainly was written before Isaiah. We know that. And so there's times when you can sort of look at these and say, wow, this is a very different view of God. But yeah, supposedly Job is the oldest, at least according to scholars. Job is the first book of the Old Testament written down. And it has this sort of arbitrary God there as well, that then sort of evolves into something different by the time you hit Isaiah. So you have this sort of, that God who just sort of gets in a, I mean, he almost basically, well, not almost, he has a bet with the devil to sort of upend poor Job's life and mess everything up. And it's a much more arbitrary, capricious God that by the time we get to Isaiah is talking in terms of universal salvation, and I'll love all of my children, not just some of my children. It's a very different conversation. Yeah.
Bill, who is the author of Genesis?
Well, the tradition says Moses, right? The tradition says Moses. Most likely it is, it was an oral tradition for hundreds, if not thousands of years that eventually got written down during the Babylonian captivity. That's when we're pretty positive all this got collated because oh no, we were defeated, we were taken into captivity, and we don't know if we're going to make it, so we better write this stuff down before we lose all these stories forever.
Who's the author of any of it?
Yeah. Who's the author of any of it? We have ideas for some parts we have a pretty clear idea on, and then others are just no one signed it, unfortunately. And even like Isaiah, even Isaiah, for instance, we're pretty positive the first 20 chapters or so are from Isaiah, but there's likely 3 different authors that, 1, 2, 3 in Isaiah, and then sometimes they'll say 4th Isaiah, depending on which scholar you talk to, because the words and text change. So it's hard to know.
There's more than one author of Genesis. Okay, there isn't just one.
There's definitely. Well, I mean, we just have even, we're not going to get to it today, but basically you just have this story, and it's pretty much, oh, Noah, here's Noah. He's told to build the ark. He builds the ark. And then literally the next line is, God spoke to Noah and said, take 7 of each animal. And you're like, wait, I thought he just said take 2 of each animal, and that he did it, and he got on the ark, and now we're back to building the ark and getting 7 animals instead of 2 animals, right? So you just have these very clear kind of process of there's 2 or 3 traditions that they brought together all at once. My bigger question sometimes is not who wrote it, but who was the editor, because they're pretty sloppy. It's a sloppy editor, to be sure.
In addition, the flood story, okay, is part of a history of almost all the peoples of that entire region.
Yeah, of a great story, of a great flood. Yeah.
Obviously
is an original to the Jewish tradition.
Yeah, and that's that. Who knows? That's one of the great debates, because Gilgamesh is the famous one. The Babylonian hero Gilgamesh is also builds a great boat and survives a great flood and keeps all the animals safe and his family as well, right? I mean, there are these similar sort of tales throughout that part of the world, which a lot of historians and scholars think it might well be a moment when the Black Sea was created, that it would have been perceived as the flood of the whole world if it happens the way they did, which they thought there might be a difference in the water levels. And then they got suddenly equalized overnight. The dam that held things back, suddenly the Mediterranean basically flooded in and created the Black Sea. It's hard to say, though. Who knows? We know that a flood clearly happened in some sort of prehistory, and it was catastrophic, but we don't know what, right? All right, so to go back a little, this is one of those things where I quote pretty heavily from Brueggemann, because I think what he says is really important to hear. But he literally goes back to verse 6, and it says, then the Lord was sorry that he had made humankind on earth, and it pained his heart. Right? He sort of looks and sees all this stuff as a mess, and it pains him, right? So Brueggemann says, verse 6 shows us the deep pathos of God. God is not angered, but grieved. He is not enraged, but saddened. The evil heart of humankind, at verse 5, the heart of humankind is planning nothing but troubles the heart of God. This is indeed a heart to heart, right? But he goes on to say, can God then change his mind? That is a central question for Israel. Israel's God is fully a person who hurts and celebrates, responds and acts in remarkable freedom. God is not captive to old resolves. He can change his mind so that he can abandon what he has made, not what he's mad, what he has made, and he can rescue that which he has condemned. With that in mind, the agenda for our narrative has quickly shifted. We are confronted in this text not with a flood, but with a heavy, painful crisis in the dealings of God with creation. It is popularly thought that the crisis of the flood is to place the world in jeopardy. But a close reading indicates that it is the heart and person of God which are placed in crisis. The crisis comes because of the resistant character of the world, which evokes hurt and grief in the heart of God. And the text affirms that God is decisively impacted by the suffering, hurt, and circumstance of his creation. which is a whole different conversation than what we usually have, right?
Mhm.
Humanity was bad, so they had to be punished because God was angry. And it's like, no, God's hurt. And so the crisis then in this story is not about punishment. It is about how does God deal with a creation that constantly rejects God. Which also, by the way, is the Christian narrative if we're listening to the New Testament. How does God deal with that as well, right? It's the story for the rest of the Bible. What does God do when creation keeps saying, I don't need you, or I only want you around when I want you around, but not most of the time, right? I mean, how does God deal with those crises? Not Gerard. So we'll talk about that here, but just a quick before I turn this off. I'll miss the next 3 weeks. I'll be in Israel. I head out next Tuesday. We'll be there until technically the following Wednesday, but then I get off a plane about an hour before we're due to start. So I'm going to say I'm not going to be able to do July 7th. I'll be in Atlanta. I won't probably be much of anything in terms of being awake or aware of where I am. But the next class then will be July 14th. Woo, almost a month from now. Anyway, other thoughts on Noah, because I think Brueggemann's brilliant in how he, and it's what the story says, right? I mean, I think Brueggemann draws our attention to the right part of the story, not just the sort of children's version of that sort of binary, God gets angry, therefore we must be punished. Punishment is actually not even listed. It's 100% this heart hurt that God has for creation that has gone awry and not listened to what God has asked. Play devil's advocate then. The interesting thing is God has not then also given commandments yet. So while things have gone awry, it is sort of worthwhile to sort of go, well, God, did you tell them what they weren't supposed to do? Or you just thought they would know better than to do it? Right? I mean, on one level, Cain kills Abel, and there's no doubt that both Cain and God knows that he did wrong. But no one ever said to Cain, you're not allowed to kill your brother. So there is that sort of question of law that Paul might bring up as he wrestles with law later on with Jesus, and what does that mean, right? I don't know. That's probably just a loophole. I think there's that sort of natural law thing would be something that people might bring up.
Seems like freedom of choice comes in very early in the Bible.
It does. It does. That freedom of will that God allows, and God regrets it pretty quick, doesn't he?
Yeah. It seems to be more than that. The God of the Old Testament, I don't want to say, I find that the Hebrews, it's really a condemnation of humanity of God.
Yeah.
And it's throughout the Old Testament. Okay, it's simply, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, I've seen, there's been some memes going around recently that I do think is completely true. The brilliance of the Old Testament is the fact that Israel doesn't censor, right? Like they tell the fact that they mess up a lot.
Yep.
And God still loves them in the midst of it. While most of the time, if you read a history of people, well, we did great things and then we did more great things and we were always great, right? Most countries edit out their errors and mistakes. You don't hear about the golden calf, right? That would have absolutely been edited by a good publicist in today's world. But instead, Israel goes, actually, that was a really important moment for all of us to realize we screwed up horribly. And God still was willing to come back and be our God in the midst of all that, even, right? So,
and still took us to the promised land, right? Yeah.
all of it, yeah. But it does get into all those. I mean, I do think on one level, this is, while the story of Noah is somewhat different, it is actually also establishing the pattern we'll see for the rest of the text, right? God gets grieved with humanity. That really makes God mad. God then is capable of being angry and frustrated with his creation, but also stays God's hand enough to say, well, I'm going to destroy all of them. Well, except for Noah, right? Well, except for the Israelites. Well, except for I'll destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. All right, well, fine, get Lot out first, right? I mean, over and over again, God sort of does both.
Well, even the end of the Noah story, okay?
Yeah.
He makes a contract with human. I'll never do it again. So.
Yep, I'll never do that one again.
Yep.
I'll do some other stuff.
Sodom and Gomorrah, I'm not going to destroy Earth. Okay, I'm not going to destroy all of humankind. I'm not going to.
Yeah, there are. So an interesting telling that I know has gone on some too now is it's interesting that humanity's sins can then be translated into the destruction of creation, right? Like while we are not all of creation, why do cats have to suffer, or dogs, or go down the list, right? Why do the birds have to suffer? But I think it actually describes pretty accurately the reality of our role as stewards and keepers of creation, right? Like that if we mess things up, then everything else suffers anyway, by way of our sin, not by way of their guilt or innocence, right?
And of course, I think the beauty of Genesis is the last story.
Mm-hmm.
Because all of a sudden there's not a God punishing. We have a God actually showing love. Okay. So that's why I like Genesis so much, I think.
Yeah. Well, and it's why, again, if you purely read this text, the way a lot of times people talk about it, which is, oh, God was mad, so he destroyed all the people of the earth, then you have a very different view than what's actually there, which is a God who is grieved and sad and doesn't want to do this, but doesn't have a choice, like is in a situation where this is my only option and I've got to figure out something here, right? How do I make it better? It's a very different view of God, which is a much more loving God than the act of putting Noah and his family on a boat is a loving God, not a angry, vengeful God. How will I preserve my creation?
Right. He doesn't want to destroy everything. Okay.
Yeah. All right, my friends. Well, that's a good note to leave on. We'll leave on a loving God.
Good idea, Bill.
The Greek God, right, Bill? Yeah, we're gonna leave on the Greek God. I like that. Yeah.
There you go.
Bill, have safe travels and a good time, fun, and
Yes,
Thank you, my friends. Thank you.
absolutely.
We'll
Enjoy
be
the trip.
We'll put up as much as we can to share.
go.
Okay.
Bye, everyone.
Take care. Bye.
All right,
Thank
bye.
you.